When Margaret Foster stepped off the stagecoach in Sweetwater Springs, Wyoming Territory, she never imagined her height would be her downfall. Standing 6 feet tall, this mail-order bride had traveled 2,000 miles with dreams of finding a husband and building a new life in the West. But as potential suitors gathered at the town hall to meet her, their eager expressions turned to mockery and rejection. "Too tall for a proper wife," they whispered. Just as she prepared to return east in humiliation, James McKinnon, a rugged rancher with no patience for small-minded gossip, saw something different. Where others saw an oddity, he recognized strength, grace, and the perfect partner for his sprawling cattle ranch. Could one man's courage to look beyond society's expectations change both their lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The daguerreotype sat heavy in Margaret Foster's hands as she traced the silver frame with trembling fingers. Her father's stern face stared back at her, his hand resting on the back of her mother's chair, a portrait taken mere months before. Consumption claimed them both. Even then, at 16, she had towered over them, her height a source of gentle teasing in their comfortable Boston home. "You'll grow into your grace," her mother would say, adjusting Margaret's posture with gentle, "And the good Lord made you tall for a reason, my dear." Those words echoed now through the empty rooms of their once prosperous townhouse, stripped bare of all but the most essential furnishings. 5 years of struggling to maintain her father's seamstress shop had drained what little savings remained. After his passing, each careful stitch, every late night bent over fine ladies' gowns, had barely kept the creditors at bay. Margaret carefully wrapped the daguerreotype in soft cloth, tucking it into her carpet bag alongside the newspaper advertisement that had caught her eye 3 months ago. Seeking God-fearing women of good character for marriage to established ranchers and businessmen in Wyoming Territory. The matchmaker's letters had painted a promising picture: strong, hard-working men seeking partners to build a life with in the expanding West. She smoothed her gray traveling dress, specially made to accommodate her height without drawing undue attention. The mirror reflected back a woman of 23, her honey-brown hair neatly coiled, green eyes bright with determination despite the shadows of exhaustion beneath them. Her height had always made her stand apart, but in Boston, at least some, understood her worth beyond the measure of inches. "You have your father's business sense," old Mrs. Wellington had said, bringing her mending each week without fail, "and your mother's kindness. Don't let anyone tell you different." But kindness and business sense hadn't been enough. Not when the fancy new dress shop opened across town, with its Paris fashions and younger seamstresses who didn't loom over their customers. Not when every social gathering became an exercise in shrinking herself, in trying to appear smaller than God had made her. The last letter from Mrs. Abigail Tate, the matchmaker, lay open on her bare dressing table. "I have several promising candidates in mind," she had written. "Men of substance and character who understand the value of a capable wife. The West is no place for fragile flowers. It needs women of strength and determination." Margaret folded the letter carefully, adding it to her small collection of treasures. Her mother's Bible, her father's ledger, the skills in her fingers, and the courage in her heart. These would have to be enough. Tomorrow, she would board the train that would carry her toward a new life, leaving behind the whispers and sidelong glances of Boston society. In the gathering dusk, she took one last look at the empty rooms where she had grown from child to woman. The walls still held shadows of the paintings they'd sold, lighter squares marking where her life had been packed away piece by piece. But she wouldn't let herself cry, not now, when she needed all her strength for the journey ahead. "The good Lord made you tall for a reason," she whispered her mother's words into the quiet house. Perhaps, in the wide-open spaces of Wyoming, she would finally discover what that reason was. The leather-bound journal lay open on Margaret's lap as the train clattered westward through Nebraska Territory. Outside her window, the familiar green. Hills of the east had given way to endless prairies that stretched toward the horizon like a golden sea. 3 days into her journey, and already the world felt larger, more wild and promising than she had imagined. My word, you are a tall one, aren't you? The woman across the aisle hadn't stopped making such observations since Denver. She was traveling to visit her son, she'd announced, and had taken it upon herself to offer Margaret unsolicited advice about her prospects. Men don't like to feel diminished, dear. Perhaps you should consider a seated profession, a school teacher, perhaps. Margaret simply smiled and returned to her journal, where she had begun recording her observations of this new world. She had endured far worse in Boston's parlors, and at least here the commentary came with a sort of frontier frankness rather than veiled malice. The train whistle pierced the afternoon air, and Margaret watched a herd of buffalo scatter across the prairie. Such magnificent creatures, she thought, powerful and proud. They didn't apologize for the space they occupied in the world. Her pen moved across the page. Perhaps that's what the West teaches, that there's room enough here for every soul to stand tall. A young mother struggled past with a crying infant, and Margaret rose to help, her height allowing her to easily lift the woman's bag into the overhead compartment. "Oh, thank you," the mother sighed gratefully. "I've been managing alone since Omaha." "Here," Margaret offered, clearing space on her bench. "Sit with me a while. The view is better on this side." She had learned that kindness often opened doors, that pride kept shut, and as the young mother settled beside her, Margaret found herself sharing dried apple slices and stories of home. "You're braver than I," the woman said, bouncing her now content baby. "Going to marry a stranger in such wild country. But then you seem strong enough for it." Strong enough. The words settled into Margaret's heart like a warm coal. She had spent so many years trying to appear smaller, but perhaps what she needed was a place big enough to match her spirit. The conductor called out another stop, and Margaret watched as more passengers crowded the aisle. A pair of cowboys tipped their hats as they passed, their eyes level with hers for once. No mockery in their gesture, just the simple courtesy of the trail. That evening, as the sun painted the prairie sky in shades of amber and rose, Margaret added more thoughts to her journal. Each mile west seems to strip away another layer of Boston propriety. Out here, perhaps what matters is not how one looks, but what one can do. Not the shape of a woman, but the shape of her character. She thought of Mrs. Tate's letters, describing the sturdy ranch houses and thriving cattle operations of Sweetwater Springs, of men who measured their worth in acres, tamed and herds tended, not in the cut of their coats or the opinions of society matrons. The train rocked gently as night fell across the prairie. Margaret watched her reflection in the darkened window, her father's strong jaw, her mother's determined eyes. She had inherited more than their height. She had their courage, too, the same spirit that had led them to build a life from nothing in Boston. Tomorrow would bring her closer to Wyoming Territory, to whatever fate awaited her in Sweetwater Springs. She smoothed a fresh page in her journal and wrote by lamplight, "I will not dim my light to make others comfortable. In this vast country, surely there is room enough for a woman to stand her full height, to reach as high as her dreams will take her." The train rolled on through the darkness, carrying Margaret toward a future as wide open as the prairie itself. And for the first time since leaving Boston, she felt not apprehension, but anticipation. Whatever waited in Sweetwater Springs, she would meet it standing tall. Sweetwater Springs emerged from the Wyoming landscape like a painting come to life. A cluster of wooden buildings nestled against rolling hills, with the jagged peaks of distant mountains piercing the cloud-streaked sky. Margaret stood on the station platform, her carpetbag clutched tight, watching as Mrs. Tate consulted the town registry she always carried. "Now then," the matchmaker said, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles, "we have quite a promising selection of gentlemen awaiting introduction." She paused, looking up at Margaret with barely concealed surprise. The letters exchanged had mentioned Margaret's height, of course, but seeing it in person seemed to give the matchmaker pause. Perhaps we should... Well, let's start with Mr. Harrison. He's quite tall himself. The walk to the town hall gave Margaret her first glimpse of her potential new home. Unlike Boston's crowded streets, Sweetwater Springs spread comfortably across the valley, as if each building had chosen its own piece of earth to claim. The spring air carried the scent of sage and new grass, so different from the coal, smoke and salt air of home. "Do mind the mud," Mrs. Tate cautioned, lifting her skirts as they crossed the unpaved street. "We're still civilizing this country bit by bit." The town hall stood proud in the center of town, its fresh white paint and tall windows speaking of prosperity and permanence. Inside, Margaret found herself facing a dozen men, each dressed in their Sunday best, their faces a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. Mr. Harrison, as it turned out, barely reached Margaret's shoulder. He spoke of his dry goods store with pride, but his eyes never quite met hers, fixed somewhere around her collarbone, as if afraid to acknowledge their height difference. "A pleasure," he managed, before quickly finding reason to speak with Mrs. Tate about some urgent business matter. The pattern repeated with each introduction. Mr. Peterson, the banker, spoke of needing a delicate touch in his household. Mr. Woods, who owned the lumber mill, made a poor joke about weather up there that set the other men laughing. Even young Mr. Collins, who had seemed promising with his earnest manner and intelligent eyes, eventually mumbled something about proper proportions before retreating. Margaret maintained her composure. Years of Boston society training serving her well, but each interaction chipped away at the hope she'd nursed during her journey west. She watched as Mrs. Tate's expression grew increasingly flustered, the matchmaker's carefully planned introductions falling apart one by one. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," Mrs. Tate suggested, her voice carrying a forced brightness. "Allow everyone to refresh themselves." The men quickly dispersed, gathering in small groups to whisper and cast glances in Margaret's direction. She heard fragments of their conversations. Unseemly. Couldn't possibly. What was the matchmaker thinking? Margaret found herself alone by the window, watching as life continued on the street outside. A woman drove a wagon loaded with supplies, her capable hands guiding the horses with easy confidence. No one seemed to care that she sat as tall on her perch as any man. "Miss Foster," Mrs. Tate approached, her registry clutched like a shield. "Perhaps we should discuss alternative arrangements. I have connections in other territories, places where perhaps the gentleman might be more willing to overlook God's design." Margaret finished quietly, still watching the woman. "With the wagon. Tell me, Mrs. Tate, do you find that the land cares how tall the hands are that work it?" The matchmaker flushed. "Now, my dear, there's no need for... I've traveled 2,000 miles, Margaret continued, turning to face the older woman. "I've sold everything I owned except what fits in that carpet bag. I didn't come seeking a man who needs to look down to see me. I came seeking a partner who can look me in the eye and see more than inches and feet." Beyond the window, the mountains rose proud against the sky. No apology in their height, no shame in their grandeur. Margaret straightened her spine, embracing every inch she'd been blessed with. Let them whisper, let them judge. She had not come this far to make herself small. The afternoon sun slanted through the town hall windows, casting long shadows across the contract papers that no one would sign. Margaret watched as Mrs. Tate gathered them with trembling hands, the rustle of paper loud in the awkward silence. The last of the potential suitors had made their excuses and departed, leaving behind a wake of whispered judgments and barely concealed smirks. "Well," Mrs. Tate said, her voice brittle as she tucked the papers into her satchel, "these things sometimes, that is to say, perhaps after a few days of consideration." But they both knew there would be no reconsideration. Margaret had seen the way the men's faces changed when they stood before her, discomfort replacing interest, embarrassment drowning out curiosity. Even now, she could hear their conversations drifting through the open windows from the street. Below, Imagine her in church, standing over everyone like that. No decent man wants to look up to his wife. Poor creature, more suited to a circus than a marriage bed. Each word struck like a physical blow, but Margaret held herself steady, the way her mother had taught her. Back straight, chin level, she whispered to herself, the familiar mantra carrying her through this fresh humiliation. Mrs. Tate busied herself with her registry, scratching out names with sharp, angry strokes. I should have been more careful in my selections. Perhaps if we tried Silver Creek, or there's a widower in Laramie who might... No. Margaret's voice was quiet, but firm. I think we both know this was a mistake. She crossed to the window, watching as the men who had rejected her gathered at the saloon across the street. They moved with the easy confidence of those who had never questioned their place in the world, never felt the sting of being too much or too different. I can arrange your return ticket, Mrs. Tate offered. The morning stage would... Yes. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of failure settle around her shoulders. The morning stage. She thought of her carefully packed trunk, full of dresses she had altered and remade for her new life. The pieces of the Boston parlor set she'd saved, wrapped in quilts her mother had made. All the hopes and dreams she'd carried west, as substantial as steam in the morning air. "And I'll have someone fetch your belongings from the hotel," Mrs. Tate continued, her words coming faster now, as if speed could soften the blow. "No need for you to... That is, perhaps it's best if you remain here until departure. People can be unkind when they've made up their minds about someone." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had known there would be challenges, had prepared herself for hardship and hard work, but this rejection, so complete, so public, cut deeper than she had imagined possible. Through the window she could see the mountains that had seemed so promising just hours before. They still stood proud against the sky, but now they felt like witnesses to her shame rather than symbols of possibility. The vast Wyoming Territory that had beckoned with its promise of new beginnings now seemed to echo with the same message she'd heard all her life. There was no place that would truly fit someone like her. "I'll make the arrangements," Mrs. Tate said softly, gathering her things. She paused at the door, looking back at Margaret's straight spine and proud head. "For what it's worth, my dear, I think they're fools. All of them." The door closed with a gentle click, leaving Margaret alone, with the lengthening shadows and the weight of dreams turning to dust in her hands. The crunch of boots on wooden floorboards drew Margaret's attention from the window. She turned, expecting Mrs. Tate's return, but instead found herself facing a stranger. He filled the doorway with his presence, tall, though not quite her height, with shoulders broadened by years of ranch work and eyes the color of summer storms. "James McKinnon," he said simply, removing his hat. His sun-weathered face bore no trace of the mockery she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, he studied her with frank appreciation, as one might admire a well-bred horse or a sturdy oak. "I heard there was a lady looking to make a life out here." Margaret straightened instinctively, preparing for another round of humiliation. "You're too late, Mr. McKinnon. The matchmaking has concluded." "Has it now?" He stepped further into the room, his movements unhurried and deliberate, the deed to his ranch poked out from his vest pocket, worn at the edges but clearly well cared for. "Seems to me the only conclusion worth noting is that Sweetwater Springs is blessed with more fools than I'd realized." His directness startled a small laugh from her. "You're very kind, but kind's got nothing to do with it." He moved closer, and Margaret realized she didn't feel the usual urge to slouch or step back. "I've got 2,000 acres of good grazing land, 100 head of cattle, and a ranch house that needs a woman's touch. What I don't have is patience for small-minded gossip or time to waste pretending to be something I'm not." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the deed, placing it carefully on the table between them. "My mother raised me to recognize quality when I see it. A woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles to build a life, who stands tall despite every fool trying to cut her down. That's the kind of partner this country needs." Margaret's heart thundered in her chest. "Mr. McKinnon, you don't know anything about me." "I know enough." His eyes held hers steadily. "I know you're strong enough to leave everything familiar behind, smart enough to maintain your dignity when others forgot theirs, and brave enough to chase a dream across half a continent." He gestured to the deed. "Everything I own is written right there. It's not a fortune, but it's good land with good prospects. I'm offering a partnership, Miss Foster. Not charity, not desperation, but an honest chance to build something worthwhile. Together." The late afternoon light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and Margaret saw in him something she'd never expected to find in Wyoming Territory. Someone who looked at her and saw not an oddity, but an equal. "A partnership," she repeated softly, testing the weight of the word. "Yes." His smile transformed his weathered face. "Though I should warn you, my mother's been praying for a tall daughter-in-law. Says she's tired of hemming every dress in the territory for me to bring home as gifts." This time Margaret's laugh held no bitterness, only surprise and dawning hope. "You're quite direct, Mr. McKinnon." "James," he corrected. "And out here, directness keeps you alive. So I'll be direct once more. Will you marry me, Miss Foster? Not because you're stranded, not because you're tall, but because I think we could build something fine together." The mountains beyond the window suddenly seemed less like witnesses to her shame and more like sentinels guarding possibility. Margaret looked at the deed on the table, at the strong hands that had placed it there, at the eyes that met hers without. Flinching. "Yes," she said, and felt the word reshape her world. "Yes, I will." McKinnon Ranch spread across the valley like a patchwork quilt. Golden pastures stitched together with rough-hewn fences, all of it hemmed by the silver thread of a creek that wound its way through the property. The wagon rattled over the uneven ground as James guided them home, Margaret's trunk secured behind them, her carpet bag at her feet. "It's not what you're used to," he said, nodding toward the ranch house that grew larger with each passing moment. "But the bones are good. Built it myself 10 years ago." The house sat proudly on a gentle rise, its weathered logs and steep roof speaking of careful craftsmanship. A wraparound porch stretched along 3 sides, and smoke curled from the stone chimney. Margaret noticed how the doorways were cut higher than usual, the windows tall and generous with light. "You built it tall," she observed, trying to keep the wonder from her voice. James's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Ma's like you. Never." Saw the sense in stooping. As if summoned by his words, a woman appeared on the porch. Even at a distance, Margaret could see the same proud carriage she'd struggled to maintain all her life. Sarah McKinnon stood easily, 6 feet tall, her silver hair caught up in a neat bun, her apron pristine, despite the morning's work evident in the fresh bread scent wafting from the house. "So," Sarah called as the wagon drew to a stop, "you've brought me a daughter at last." Her eyes, the same storm grey as her son's, assessed Margaret with frank interest. "And a fine tall one at that. Come down, child. Let me look at you proper." Margaret climbed down from the wagon with the grace her mother had drilled into her, refusing to rush, despite her nerves. Sarah McKinnon's scrutiny was different from the town's judgment. This was the evaluation of a woman who had carved her own place in this wild country. "Boston bred, I hear," Sarah said, stepping closer. "But you got strength in those shoulders. Good hands, too, not afraid of work, I'd wager." "No, ma'am," Margaret replied. "I ran my father's seamstress shop for 5 years after his passing." "Did you now?" Sarah's expression warmed. "And here I've been making do with my own rough stitching all these years. The Lord does provide, doesn't he?" She turned to her son, who was unloading Margaret's trunk. "James McKinnon, you might have mentioned she was a seamstress when you came tearing home about getting married." "Didn't ask," James grunted, lifting the trunk with careful strength. "Didn't matter." Sarah's laugh was rich and deep. "No, I suppose it wouldn't. Not to you." She linked her arm through Margaret's, leading her toward the house. "Come along, dear. I've got coffee brewing and fresh bread cooling. We'll let him manage the heavy lifting while you tell me what possessed you to say yes to my bull-headed son after knowing him all of 10 minutes. Inside, the house revealed itself as a testament to practical comfort. The ceiling beams rose high overhead, the furniture was sturdy and well-made, and windows welcomed light from every direction. But it was the kitchen that caught Margaret's breath. A magnificent cast-iron stove gleamed against one wall, while copper pots hung in graduated rows, their surfaces reflecting the morning sun. "James insisted on the best fixtures," Sarah explained, catching Margaret's look. "Said if we were going to cook for ranch hands, we ought to have proper tools." She poured coffee into 3 tall mugs, the rich aroma filling the air. "Though I suspect he had other reasons for wanting everything built to size." Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm mug, feeling something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "He planned for a tall wife." "He planned for the right wife," Sarah corrected, gently. "Though I'll admit, I've been praying for someone who could reach the top shelves without a ladder. The Lord does love to surprise us with how he answers prayers, doesn't he?" Through the window, Margaret watched James crossing the yard, his movements sure and purposeful. He paused to right a tilted fence post, and the simple action spoke volumes about the care he took with his land, his home, his responsibilities. "Easy now," James said, adjusting the stirrups on the saddle he'd modified for Margaret's height. "Belle's gentle, but she'll sense if you're nervous." The mare stood patiently in the early morning light, her dappled grey coat gleaming like polished silver. Margaret ran a hand along the horse's neck, remembering how the ladies in Boston rode side-saddle, perched like delicate birds on their mounts. Here, James had insisted she learn to ride astride, practical rather than proper. "She's beautiful," Margaret murmured, noting how the stirrups had been carefully lengthened and reinforced to accommodate her long legs. Like everything else at McKinnon Ranch, the tack was adapted to suit the rider, rather than force the rider to adapt. "Been saving her for someone special," James replied, his weathered hands checking the girth strap one final time. "Most folks wanted to buy her for their daughters, but Belle's got too much spirit to be a child's pony. She needs someone who'll appreciate her strength." Margaret gathered her split riding skirt, another of Sarah's practical contributions to her new life, and placed her foot in the stirrup. The motion felt awkward at first, but her height allowed her to mount smoothly, settling into the saddle, with more grace than she'd expected. "There now," James said with satisfaction. "You two suit each other." He swung up onto his own horse, a sturdy bay stallion, and guided them toward the pasture gate. "We'll start slow, let you get a feel for her movement." The morning air carried the scent of sage and fresh grass as they rode side by side. Margaret felt her body gradually relaxing into the rhythm of Belle's walk, learning the subtle shifts that communicated between horse and rider. Each step brought a new discovery. The way the valley opened before them, how the distant mountains seemed to move with their progress, the gentle sway that felt increasingly natural. "My mother would faint to see me now," Margaret laughed, as Belle picked her way carefully along the creek bank. "She always said a lady should never let her knees show, even in private." James glanced at her split skirt and practical boots with approval. "Hard to work cattle in proper Boston fashion, though I suspect your mother would be proud to see you adapting so well." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, James occasionally offering quiet instruction about posture or rein control. When they reached a broader stretch of pasture, he taught her how to guide Belle into a gentle trot, then a rolling canter that made Margaret's heart soar with unexpected joy. "You're a natural," he called, as she mastered the posting rhythm that Sarah had explained over breakfast. "Most beginners fight the horse's movement. You're learning to flow with it." Later, as they rested the horses in the shade of a cottonwood grove, James spread a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples on a blanket. Margaret watched as Belle grazed nearby, the mare's tall frame no longer seeming imposing, but perfectly suited to the vast landscape around them. "I never thought I'd feel this way," Margaret admitted, accepting the canteen James offered. In Boston, everything was about fitting into proper spaces, making oneself smaller to suit others' expectations. But out here, we fit. The space to suit the need," James finished. No sense in building low doors when tall folks need to walk through them. His eyes met hers with quiet understanding. Same goes for hearts and minds, I reckon. The sun had shifted toward afternoon. When they finally turned back toward the ranch house, Margaret felt pleasantly tired, her muscles aching in new ways, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. She caught glimpses of their shadows stretching across the grass, horse and rider moving as one, tall and proud against the Wyoming sky. "Tomorrow," James said as they approached the barn, "we'll start learning about the cattle. Think you're ready for that?" Margaret looked at him, seeing not judgment or doubt in his expression, but genuine partnership. "Yes," she replied, her confidence growing with each passing hour. "I believe I am." The broken fence line stretched before Margaret like an accusation, posts splintered and wire tangled where the panicked cattle had crashed through. Dawn was just breaking over the mountains, painting the destruction in shades of pink and gold. Two of James's best calves had escaped during the night, driven by the same spring storm that had toppled the ancient cottonwood onto the fence. "Track leads north," Tom, one of the ranch hands, reported. His eyes slid past Margaret as he addressed James directly. "Probably headed for the Box Canyon. We can round them up, boss. No need to trouble the missus with—" "The missus," Margaret interrupted calmly, already checking Belle's saddle straps, "is coming with you." She caught James's slight smile as she mounted, her movements now practiced and sure after weeks in the saddle. The ranch hands exchanged glances, but knew better than to argue when James swung up onto his own horse. "Tom, you and Bill start mending this fence," he ordered. "Margaret and I will fetch those calves." They rode out together, following the distinct tracks of the young cattle through the wet spring grass. Margaret's split riding skirt was practical for the task, another of her modifications to ranch life. She'd spent evenings adapting her Boston dresses, much to Sarah's approval, creating clothing that allowed her to work alongside the men without sacrificing either modesty or mobility. The Box Canyon opened before them, its steep walls rising. Like the pages of an open book, the calves' tracks led straight in, but something about the scene made Margaret rein Belle to a stop. "Wait!" she called to James, who had started to follow the trail. "Look at how the grass is bent there at the canyon mouth." Something else came through after the calves. James dismounted to examine the signs she'd spotted. "Mountain lion," he confirmed grimly. "Fresh tracks, too. No wonder those calves were running scared." Margaret felt her heart quicken, but kept her voice steady. "The canyon walls are too steep for the calves to climb, but a lion could easily manage it. They'll be trapped." "We need to move fast," James agreed, remounting. "But careful. A cornered cat's the most dangerous kind." They proceeded into the canyon, moving slowly to avoid spooking either predator or prey. Margaret's height gave her a clear view over the boulder-strewn ground, and she was the first to spot movement ahead. "There," she whispered, pointing to a natural corral formed by fallen rocks. The calves huddled together, while a tawny shape crouched on a ledge above them, preparing to spring. James reached for his rifle, but the angle was wrong. He couldn't get a clear shot without risking the calves. The mountain lion tensed, its muscles bunching for the killing leap. Without hesitation, Margaret urged Belle forward. Her height in the saddle made her appear even more imposing as she charged toward the ledge, her shadow falling across the mountain lion's hunting ground. The big cat turned, startled by this new threat that seemed to rise up impossibly tall against the canyon wall. "Ha!" Margaret's shout echoed off the stone, sharp and commanding. She raised her arms, making herself even larger, while Belle danced beneath her, the mare's hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground. The mountain lion hesitated, its ordinary prey forgotten in the face of this strange, towering creature that seemed to challenge its dominance. For a breathless moment, predator and woman locked eyes. Then the cat turned and bounded up the canyon wall, vanishing over the rim like morning mist. James was already calming the calves, his rope settling surely around their necks. "That," he said with quiet pride, "was some quick thinking." Margaret felt the tension drain from her shoulders as she dismounted to help him. I remembered what you said about making yourself big when facing down predators. Seemed I had a natural advantage. There. They worked together to lead the calves home, the young animals surprisingly docile after their frightening night. The sun was well up by the time they reached the broken fence line, where Tom and Bill had nearly finished repairs. The ranch hands straightened as Margaret approached, and this time their eyes met hers directly. Heard you face down a mountain. Lion, ma'am, Tom said, touching his hat brim with new respect. Reckon we're glad to have someone who can look danger in the eye without blinking. Yes, James agreed, his hand finding Margaret's as they surveyed the mended fence together. That's exactly why I married her. Margaret squeezed his fingers, feeling the rough calluses that matched the new ones forming on her own palms. Here, finally, was a place where her height wasn't just accepted, it was an asset, as natural and necessary as the strong fence posts that would keep their cattle safe, as true as the love growing between her and the man who had seen her strength from the very beginning. The general store's bell chimed as Margaret pushed through the door, her shopping list and James's credit slip tucked securely in her pocket. After 2 months on the ranch, necessity had finally driven her into Sweetwater Springs alone. The kitchen needed restocking, and both James and Sarah were occupied with a difficult carving. Mr. Harrison, who had once been among her potential suitors, stood frozen behind the counter, a bolt of calico fabric forgotten in his hands. The other shoppers, mostly ranch wives she hadn't yet met, paused in their gossip to stare. Margaret drew herself up to her full height, refusing to slouch, as she had so often done in Boston shops. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. I'll need 20 pounds of flour, 10 of sugar, and 5 of coffee to start." She presented James's credit slip, her voice calm and clear in the hushed store. "Mrs. McKinnon," he managed, taking the slip with obvious discomfort. That is, we usually have one of the boys carry such heavy orders." "No need," Margaret replied, already moving to inspect the fabric bolts. "I drove the wagon in specifically. For a large order." She selected a sturdy cotton print, perfect for the curtains Sarah had mentioned wanting. "I'll take 5 yards of this as well." The whispers started as she moved through the store, adding items to her list. "Did you hear? James McKinnon actually married her. Must be half giant on her mother's side. Poor man. What was he thinking?" Margaret continued her shopping with deliberate grace, though each whisper stung like a needle prick. She was examining lamp oil when Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, who had once smiled so condescendingly at her, approached with false sweetness. "My dear, you simply must tell us. How do you manage in that little ranch house? I hear the McKinnons built it quite rustic, though I suppose you're used to roughing it, being so unique." Margaret turned slowly, meeting the shorter woman's gaze. "Actually, Mrs. Peterson, the house is perfectly sized. James believes in building to suit the needs of those who live there." She smiled, gentle but firm, much like his mind and heart. A few of the other women shifted uncomfortably, but Mrs. Peterson pressed on. "Yes, well, James always was different, though I'm sure you're very grateful he was willing to recognize quality when he sees it," Margaret finished, her voice carrying just enough to reach the gathered audience. "Yes, I am. Just as I'm grateful he values strength over artificial constraints and character over common prejudice." She placed her final items on the counter. "The total, Mr. Harrison?" The storekeeper fumbled with his ledger, clearly torn between his instinct to treat her as an oddity and his respect for James McKinnon's credit. $12.43, Mrs. McKinnon. Margaret signed the credit slip with a flourish, her mother's lessons in penmanship evident in each elegant stroke. "Please have these loaded in my wagon. And Mr. Harrison," she paused at the door, "you might consider ordering some of those new adjustable dress forms from back east. I noticed several of these ladies could benefit from properly fitted clothing, and I'd be happy to put my seamstress skills to use, if they're interested in quality work rather than quick judgments." The bell chimed again as she stepped out into the sunshine. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the wagon reins. But she kept her back straight as she guided the horses down the main street. Through the store window, she could see the women clustering around Mr. Harrison, no doubt discussing her audacity. But there was something different in their whispers. Now a note of uncertainty, perhaps even respect. She had faced them on her own terms, neither apologizing for her height nor letting it define her worth. As the wagon cleared the town limits, Margaret finally allowed herself to relax. The mountains rose before her, their peaks reaching proudly toward the sky, and she thought of James's words on their wedding day. The only measure that matters is the one you set for yourself. The ranch appeared in the distance, its tall windows gleaming like welcome beacons. Sarah stood on the porch, waving a dish towel in greeting, while James emerged from the barn, his smile visible even at a distance. Here was home, not just the buildings sized to fit her, but the hearts within them that had never asked her to be anything less than herself. The old recipe book's leather cover was soft with age, its pages spotted with evidence of years of use. A splash of vanilla here, a dusting of flour there. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, and Margaret noticed how the older woman's fingers, once so strong and sure, seemed thinner now. "My grandmother brought this from Scotland," Sarah explained, smoothing a yellowed page. Added, "Her own recipes alongside the old ones. Then my mother did the same, and I after her." She looked up at Margaret, her storm-grey eyes bright with meaning. "Time you started adding yours, don't you think?" The kitchen was warm with morning sun and the scent of fresh coffee. Outside, they could hear James and the hands moving cattle to the summer pastures, their voices carrying on the spring breeze. Margaret sat beside Sarah at the broad kitchen table, their heights matching naturally. No need to stoop or stretch. "I'm not sure my Boston recipes would fit here," Margaret said softly, thinking of the delicate tea cakes and fussy pastries she'd once made. Sarah's laugh was rich and knowing. "Child, that's what we all think at first. But recipes are like people. They adapt when given room to grow." She pointed to a page spotted with red wine. "Look here. My mother's Scottish shortbread, but she added dried huckleberries after her first summer in Wyoming, made it her own." Margaret traced the faded handwriting, noting how 3 generations of women had marked their presence in these pages. "I do make a fine apple pie," she offered, "though I've been thinking of adding sage honey to the filling, since it grows so wild here." "There you have it," Sarah nodded approvingly. "You're learning to blend what you brought with what you've found, just as you've done with everything else." They worked together through the morning, Sarah teaching Margaret the ranch recipes that had sustained cowboys and carving season alike. But when the older woman reached for a heavy pot, her hands shook more noticeably. "Here, let me," Margaret said, easily lifting the cast iron from its hook. She saw something flash across Sarah's face, not offense at the help, but a deeper worry. "Been happening more lately," Sarah admitted, sinking into a chair. "Dr. Smith says it's just age creeping up, but—" She squared her shoulders, so like James in her quiet strength. "I need to know my son will be cared for, that this ranch will have a woman's touch that reaches as high as its needs." Margaret set the pot down and knelt beside Sarah's chair, taking those work-worn hands in her own. "I used to curse my height," she said quietly. "Thought it made me unfit for a woman's proper place. But you and James showed me that proper places are where we make them." Sarah's fingers tightened around hers. "The first time James wrote about you, he didn't mention how tall you were. Just said he'd found someone who could see eye to eye with him on what mattered." She smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "My boy always did have clear vision, even if the rest of the world was too short-sighted to share it." They returned to their cooking, but something had shifted between them, a deepening of trust, a passing of responsibility. Margaret found herself noting each recipe with new attention, not just the ingredients, but the stories behind them. The stew that could stretch to feed unexpected guests, the bread that stayed fresh on long cattle drives, the cookies that had comforted James through childhood ailments. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah began humming an old Scottish ballad. Margaret recognized it from her own mother's kitchen and joined in, their voices harmonizing in the warm air. The recipe book lay open between them, ready for new entries, new adaptations, new stories to be added to its well-worn pages. "We'll add your apple pie recipe this afternoon," Sarah declared, her voice stronger now, with the sage honey variation. "It's time these pages had your hand in them too." She paused, looking at Margaret with clear affection. "Welcome to the family, truly and fully, daughter." And in that moment, Margaret understood. She hadn't just married James, she'd been adopted into a legacy of strong women who had shaped their world to fit them, rather than the other way around. The recipe book was more than a collection of instructions. It was a testimony to their resilience, their adaptability, their love. The branding iron glowed red in the morning light as Margaret lifted it from the fire. Around her, the ranch hands paused in their work, watching as she approached the calf held steady in the branding pen. Her movements were confident now. No hesitation as she pressed the iron against the young steer's hide, marking it with the McKinnon brand. Her brand now, too. "Clean strike," James commented from where he sat astride his horse, overseeing the spring branding. His voice carried pride that had nothing to do with the task itself and everything to do with the woman performing it. "Couldn't have done better." "Myself." The ranch hands nodded in agreement, their initial skepticism long since replaced by genuine respect. They'd learned that Mrs. McKinnon's height meant she could look them in the eye when giving instructions, that her long reach could secure a calf as well as any man's, that her strength was matched by her keen mind for ranch operations. "Tom," Margaret called, returning the iron to the fire. "Bring the next group through. We'll want to finish before the heat of the day." She checked her ledger, where she'd been recording each branded calf with the precise bookkeeping skills honed in. Her father's shop. 123 so far, best spring count we've had. As Tom moved to comply, Margaret caught James watching her with a particular expression, one she'd come to recognize as his quiet amazement at how naturally she'd taken to ranch life. It was the same look he'd worn when she'd suggested rotating, the grazing patterns to protect the spring grass, or when she'd redesigned the barn's storage to accommodate their expanding herd. "Penny for your thoughts, husband," she said as she approached his horse, shading her eyes against the rising sun. James reached down, his hand finding hers with the ease of growing intimacy. "Just thinking how some folks in town called me foolish for marrying a woman who'd look down on me." His thumb traced the calluses that now matched his own. "Never occurred to them that the view's better when you're standing at the same height." Their moment was interrupted by a commotion from the holding pen. A young bull, more spirited than his fellows, had broken free and was charging toward the open gate. Without hesitation, Margaret grabbed the rope from her saddle horn. She'd taken to keeping Belle saddled during branding for just such emergencies. In one fluid motion, she mounted and spurred after the escaping bull. Her height gave her the leverage to throw the rope with perfect accuracy, catching the animal's horns. Belle, responsive to the slightest cue, helped her turn the bull back toward the pen. "Like watching a dance, ain't it?" she heard old Bill say to the newer hands. "Way she and that horse moved together, like they was made for each other." Back at the pens, James had dismounted to help secure the bull. Together, they guided it into the enclosure, their movements synchronized by months of working as one. When the gate was latched, he turned to her with a grin. "Remember when you worried you wouldn't fit in here?" Margaret laughed, remembering her early fears. "Seems foolish now, though I suppose I have you to thank for that, you and your mother, showing me that fitting in isn't about making yourself smaller." "No," James agreed, his hand finding the small of her back. "It's about finding the place that fits who you are." He glanced at the gathered ranch hands, who had returned to their tasks with comfortable familiarity, and maybe showing others how to widen their view of what's possible. The morning wore on, sun climbing higher as they worked through the remaining calves. Margaret moved between tasks with practiced ease, marking the ledger, checking brands, directing the hands. She had learned to read the rhythm of ranch life like she once read patterns in fabric, understanding how each piece contributed to the whole. During a brief break, she found herself standing with James by the chuck wagon, sharing coffee from tin cups. The spring breeze carried the scent of sage and new grass, and in the distance the mountains stood proud against the sky. "I was thinking," she said, her free hand sketching plans in the air, "we could expand the north pasture before next spring. That rise there would shelter the young calves from the wind, and there's good water access." James nodded, seeing the future she was mapping. "Already planning for next year? And the year after," Margaret confirmed. "I think we have some good years ahead of us." His smile deepened the laugh lines around his eyes. "That we do, Mrs. McKinnon. That we do." The telegraph arrived on a perfect summer morning, its innocent yellow envelope carrying words that would shatter the peace of McKinnon Ranch. Margaret was in the kitchen with Sarah, going over the week's accounts, when Tom rode in from town at a gallop. "Urgent message, Mrs. McKinnon," he called, his face troubled as he handed her the envelope. "Mr. Peterson from the bank asked me to deliver it personal-like." Margaret broke the seal, her eyes scanning the brief message. The paper trembled slightly in her hands as she read, "Arriving Sweetwater Springs. Stop business concerning McKinnon Ranch deed. Stop Matthew Blackwood, stop." "What is it, child?" Sarah asked, noting Margaret's sudden pallor. "Bad news?" "Matthew Blackwood," Margaret whispered. "He was one of the Boston suitors I corresponded with before coming west. His letter arrived too late. I was already on the train." She looked up at Sarah, her voice strengthening with determination. "He's a banker, a wealthy one." Sarah's expression hardened with understanding. "And now he's coming here. After all this time." The screen door creaked and James entered, trail dust still on his clothes from the morning's work. One look at Margaret's face told him something was wrong. "What's happened?" Margaret handed him the telegram, watching as his eyes narrowed at the message. "Blackwood," he said slowly. "Why would a Boston banker have business with our ranch?" "Deed?" Before Margaret could answer, another rider appeared in the yard. It was Bill Peterson, the Sweetwater Springs banker, his usual pompous manner heightened by obvious agitation. "James," he called, dismounting hastily. "We need to talk. There's been a development regarding your deed." They gathered in the parlor, the room suddenly feeling too small, despite its generous proportions. Peterson mopped his brow with a handkerchief as he explained. "Mr. Blackwood's bank has acquired several outstanding loans in the territory, including," he paused, glancing nervously at James, "including the original note on McKinnon Ranch." "That note was paid off years ago," James said sharply. "When my father died," Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "There seems to be some discrepancy in the records. Mr. Blackwood claims the final payment was never properly recorded, without clear documentation." "This is nonsense," Sarah interrupted, her voice steel-edged. "We have the papers." "Papers can be lost," Peterson replied delicately, "or questioned. Mr. Blackwood's bank is quite influential. They're developing significant interests in Wyoming Territory." Margaret felt cold, despite the summer heat. She remembered Matthew Blackwood from Boston society, ambitious, ruthless in business, and used to getting his way. He had been among those who'd written to Mrs. Tate about a mail-order bride, seeking a proper wife to advance his social position. "When does he arrive?" she asked, her mind already racing ahead to the confrontation to come. "Tomorrow's stage," Peterson answered. "He's expressed particular interest in meeting the current Mrs. McKinnon." The emphasis on current was slight, but unmistakable. Margaret stood, her full height making Peterson step back instinctively. "Then we'll be ready to meet him." James rose beside her, his hand finding hers. "This is our land," he said quietly. "Built by McKinnon hands, paid for with McKinnon sweat and blood. No city banker can take that from us." But Margaret knew Matthew Blackwood, knew the power of his money and connections, the casual cruelty of his ambition. He had once dismissed her as too tall for polite society. Now he was coming to Wyoming, armed with questionable documents, and the power to destroy the life she and James had built. She squeezed James's hand, drawing strength from his steadiness. They had faced down mountain lions and winter storms together. They would face this threat the same way, standing tall, standing together. Long after Peterson departed, the McKinnons gathered around the kitchen table, their faces illuminated by lamplight as they spread out years of carefully preserved documents. Sarah's fingers traced the faded ink of receipt after receipt, while James examined the original deed with fierce concentration. "Here," Margaret said suddenly, her seamstress's eye for detail catching something in the leather-bound ledger. "Look at how Father McKinnon recorded his payments. He didn't just note the amounts, he listed the bank's representative who signed for each one." James leaned closer, his shoulder pressing against hers as they studied the precise handwriting. "Phillips, Carter, Phillips again. All men who worked at the Territorial Bank before Peterson took over. And all respected names in the community," Sarah added, her voice strengthening with purpose. "Some of them are still here in Sweetwater Springs. Samuel Phillips retired just last year, lives out by the creek with his daughter's family." Margaret was already reaching for paper and ink. "We'll need statements from each of them, properly witnessed, and we should send Tom to fetch Mr. Phillips tonight. His testimony will carry the most weight." As she wrote, Margaret remembered Matthew, Blackwood's offices in Boston, all polish and pretension. He had built his reputation on acquiring distressed properties, using his network of lawyers to find or create weaknesses in deeds and titles. But he had never faced the kind of community that existed in Sweetwater Springs, where a person's word still carried weight and neighbors stood together against outside threats. "I'll ride for Judge Wilson at first light," James said, studying the territory map on the wall. "He's only half a day's ride, and he's no friend to eastern banks trying to grab up ranch land." Sarah gathered the payment receipts into a neat stack, her movements deliberate. "I'll speak with Martha Peterson. Her husband may be cowed by Boston money, but Martha knows which side her bread's buttered on. Half the ranch wives in the Territory bank with Bill because of her good sense." A knock at the door interrupted their planning. Tom stood in the doorway, Samuel Phillips beside him. The retired banker's face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp as he took in the papers spread across the table. "Heard we've got trouble," he said without preamble. "Eastern banker thinking he can muscle in on McKinnon land?" He settled into the chair Margaret offered, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah. "Well, my memory's just fine. And I remember every payment John McKinnon made, signed for most of them myself." Margaret watched as the old banker began going through the ledger, noting dates and amounts with professional precision. Here was the difference between Blackwood's world and the one she'd found in Wyoming. There, power came from papers and lawyers. Here, it grew from the soil itself, nourished by generations of trust and hard work. "We'll need to be ready when he arrives tomorrow," she said, meeting James's eyes across the table. "He'll expect to find a desperate rancher and a lonely mail-order bride. Instead, James finished with a smile that held all the quiet strength of the mountains themselves. "He'll find the McKinnons. All of us." Later, as they prepared for bed, Margaret stood at their bedroom window, looking out over the ranch that had become so much more than a refuge. The moon cast long shadows across the pastures where their cattle grazed, the barn they'd improved together, the gardens she'd planted with Sarah. "We won't let him take it," James said softly, coming to stand beside her. "This land knows who it belongs to." Margaret leaned into his strength, both of them tall and proud against the star-filled sky. "Yes," she agreed, "and tomorrow Matthew Blackwood will learn that too." The ranch account book sat open before Margaret in the early morning light, each page telling its own story of the McKinnon's success. She'd spent hours transcribing the year's figures into clear columns, cattle counts, grazing improvements, profit margins that showed steady growth. Every number was a weapon in the coming battle, every calculation a shield against Blackwood's threats. "The stage will arrive at noon," James said, coming in from his dawn inspection of the herds. His voice was steady, but Margaret caught the tension in his shoulders as he poured coffee. "Judge Wilson's riding in from the south, should be here any minute." Sarah worked at the stove, her movements slower these days but no less determined. Martha Peterson sent word she's convinced half the town council to attend the meeting. Says they're none too pleased about Eastern Banks trying to steal Wyoming land. The coffee pot rattled slightly as James set it down. "It's not just the land he's after." Margaret met his eyes, knowing he'd seen through to the heart of it. Matthew Blackwood had been furious when she'd chosen to travel west instead of waiting for his suit. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially from women who dared to stand at their full height. "No," she agreed quietly. "It's not just the land." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their thoughts. Judge Wilson rode into the yard, his judicial dignity somewhat at odds with his trail-dusty appearance. But his eyes were sharp as he dismounted, taking in the neat ranch house, the well-maintained fences, the healthy cattle in the nearby pasture. "Quite a change from when your father ran this place, James," he commented as they settled in the parlor. "I see marriage agrees with you." Margaret brought out the ledgers and documents they'd organized the night before. The judge examined each paper carefully, paying particular attention to Samuel Phillips's sworn statement about the loan payments. "Blackwood's playing a dangerous game," he said finally. "These accusations about missing payments, they're not just questioning your deed. They're implying fraudulent behavior by our territorial bank." He looked up at Margaret. "You knew him in Boston?" "Yes, Your Honor. He was particular about maintaining proper appearances, about everything being in its correct place, according to his measure." The judge's mouth twitched. "And you didn't fit his measure?" "No, sir. I stood too tall for his taste." "But not for Wyoming." The judge gathered the papers into a neat stack. "Out here, we measure people by what they build, what they contribute. And from these accounts, you've built something remarkable together." Through the window, they could see more riders approaching. Martha Peterson leading several town council members, Samuel Phillips in a wagon driven by his daughter, other neighbors who'd heard about the threat to McKinnon Ranch. "Your community stands with you," the judge observed. "That counts for more than all of Blackwood's Boston money." Sarah came in with fresh coffee, her back straight despite her fatigue. "We've faced down worse than him. Blizzards, drought, mountain lions, bears," James added with a small smile at Margaret. "Bears?" the judge inquired. "Found one in the smokehouse last fall," Margaret explained. "James was out with the herd, so I handled it myself." "Turns. Out bears aren't so fond of facing someone at eye level." The story lightened the mood briefly, but as the morning wore on, tension crept back. Margaret found herself touching the ranch ledger like a talisman, its pages filled with proof of their hard work and success. Each entry represented a choice she'd made, a future she'd chosen, one far different from the life Blackwood had once offered. "Almost time," James said as the sun climbed higher. He stood beside her at the window, watching dust rise from the road into town. Having second thoughts about facing him, Margaret straightened to her full height, feeling the strength that came not just from her stature, but from knowing exactly who and what she was. "No. In Boston, I spent so much time trying to seem smaller, to fit into the spaces others thought proper. But here," she gestured to their home, "built tall to match its inhabitants, to the land that stretched wide and free around them. Here, I learned that the proper space is the one you create by standing your full height." James took her hand, his calluses matching hers after months of shared work. "Then let's go show Matthew Blackwood what that looks like." Outside, there, neighbors gathered, ready to ride into town together. The mountains rose behind them, tall and unbending, a reminder that some things were meant to stand at their full measure, answering to no one's standards but their own. The procession into Sweetwater Springs grew with each passing mile. What had started as the McKinnon family and a few neighbors swelled into a statement of territorial unity. Ranchers left their morning work to join them. Wives rode up in wagons, carrying baskets of food, and even old Tommy Roberts, who hadn't left his homestead in 3 years, hitched up his mules to stand with them. Margaret rode beside James, Belle matching stride with his stallion. She wore her best riding dress, altered to fit her height perfectly, no compromise, no apologetic slouching. Sarah travelled in the wagon behind them, a stack of letters clutched in her lap. Throughout the morning, riders had arrived at the ranch bearing written testimonials about the McKinnon's character and contribution to the territory. "Never seen anything like it," Tom murmured to Bill as they rode guard on the wagon. "Folk dropping everything to stand up against some fancy Eastern banker." "Ain't about the banker," Bill replied. "It's about what's right. McKinnon's built something worth defending here." They crested the last rise before town, and Margaret caught her breath. The street before the bank was filled with people. Ranchers, merchants, wives who had once whispered about her height. Now, they stood waiting, a clear message in their presence. Martha Peterson hurried up as they dismounted. "He's inside with Bill," she reported, her usual propriety ruffled by excitement. "Been demanding to see the McKinnons since the stage arrived. Says he has documents proving the loan default." Judge Wilson straightened his coat. "Does he indeed? Well, we have some documents of our own." They gathered in the street, organizing their evidence and supporters. Samuel Phillips sat in a chair outside the bank, his white hair gleaming in the sun, ready to testify about every payment John McKinnon had made. The town council members stood nearby, their presence a reminder that Sweetwater Springs governed its own affairs. Mr. Harrison emerged from his store, carrying a ledger. "Found my father's old accounts," he said, approaching Margaret almost shyly. "Shows all the supplies John McKinnon bought while he was paying off that loan. Man doesn't invest in fence posts and breeding stock if he's planning to default." Margaret accepted the ledger, remembering how Harrison had once dismissed her as a potential wife. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This will help." "Mrs. McKinnon," he hesitated, "I was wrong, you know, about a lot of things. You've done right by this town." Sarah touched Margaret's arm, drawing her attention to the growing crowd. Women who had once whispered behind their hands now stood openly in support. Ranch hands, who had doubted her ability to work cattle, gathered with their families, ready to speak for the McKinnons' integrity. "I never thought," Margaret began. "You never thought you'd find such a perfect fit," Sarah finished. "Sometimes the Lord makes us tall so we can see over the walls others build. And sometimes he leads us to places where those walls don't exist at all." James joined them, carrying the ranch's deed. "Blackwood's asking for us. Says he wants to discuss terms before things become official." Margaret squared her shoulders, feeling the strength of the community around them. "Then let's not keep him waiting." "Wait!" called a voice from the crowd. Mrs. Tate, the matchmaker who had first brought Margaret to Sweetwater Springs, pushed forward. She carried a familiar-looking folder. "My records," she explained, "of Mr. Blackwood's original inquiry about a mail-order bride. His requirements were quite specific and quite revealing about his character." Judge Wilson accepted the folder with interest. "More evidence of his true intentions, I suspect." They gathered their documents, the ranch ledgers showing their success, the testimonials proving their worth, the records revealing Blackwood's past, like arrows in a quiver. But their greatest weapon was the living proof around them. A community, united, standing tall together against those who would impose their narrow measures on Wyoming's open spaces. "Ready?" James asked, offering Margaret his arm. She looked at their assembled neighbors, at Sarah's proud smile, at the town that had learned to look past appearances to see true worth. The same sun that had once illuminated her shame now shone on her triumph, not just her own, but a victory shared by all who had chosen to stand with them. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong. "I believe we are." Matthew Blackwood stood by the bank's polished counter, every inch the Boston banker in his fine wool suit and silk cravat. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as Margaret entered beside James. She remembered that look from Boston parlors, the quick calculation of her height, followed by swift dismissal of her worth. "Mrs. McKinnon," he said, her married name carrying a hint of mockery. "How unexpected to find you here. When you failed to wait for my response in Boston, I feared some misfortune had befallen you." "No misfortune, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret replied evenly, "simply good fortune of a different kind." The bank's interior had grown crowded. Judge Wilson took his place behind Peterson's desk, while Sarah sat nearby with her collection of letters. Through the windows, Margaret could see the gathered townspeople, their presence a silent testimony. "Well," Blackwood said, straightening his cuffs, "let's discuss the business at hand. I've acquired certain interests in this territory, including the note on this property." He placed a leather folio on the counter. "My investigation has revealed serious irregularities in the loan payments. As the current holder of the note, I have the right to call it due immediately." James stepped forward, his own documents ready. "Every payment was made and recorded. We have proof." "Ah, but proof can be such a delicate thing." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Especially in these frontier territories. Papers get lost. Records become confused. My bank's documentation is quite clear." "Documentation you somehow acquired years after the original loan was paid." Judge Wilson's voice carried the weight of his office. "That's a serious claim, Mr. Blackwood. Banking is a serious business, Your Honor, one that requires proper attention to detail, proper adherence to standards." His gaze slid to Margaret. "Something I fear was lacking in several matters concerning this territory." The implied insult hung in the air, but Margaret stood straighter, remembering the mountain lion she'd faced down. "Standards," she said clearly, "or prejudices, Mr. Blackwood." Sarah rose slowly, her dignity matching any Boston matron's. "Perhaps we should examine all the standards involved here." She began laying out letters on the desk. "These are testimonials from every major ranching family in the territory. Each one details their business dealings with McKinnon Ranch, the improvements made under my son and daughter-in-law's management, the value they've added to this community." Samuel Phillips spoke up from his chair. "I personally handled the McKinnon loan payments, every one of them properly recorded and witnessed." His voice might have weakened with age, but his banker's precision remained sharp. "Any documentation suggesting otherwise is fabricated. A retired banker's memory," Blackwood began dismissively. "And my records," Mr. Harrison interrupted, stepping forward with his ledger, "showing all the supplies purchased during the loan period. Investments that proved John McKinnon's intent to maintain and improve his property." Martha Peterson moved to stand beside her husband. "The town council has also reviewed the matter. We have serious concerns about any attempt to invalidate our territorial bank's records." Blackwood's confident smile slipped slightly. "The council has no jurisdiction over private banking matters." "No," Judge Wilson agreed. "But they do have jurisdiction over who's allowed to conduct business in this territory. Attempting to seize property through fraudulent claims could be considered a serious offense. And then," Mrs. Tate added, opening her folder with flourish, "there's the matter of your other business in this territory." She met Blackwood's gaze steadily. "Your inquiry about a mail-order bride was quite specific. You wanted someone, and, I quote, properly proportioned to reflect the dignity of a banking family. When you learned of Miss Foster's height, you wrote that such a match would be unsuitable for a man of your position." Margaret watched understanding ripple through the crowd. This wasn't just about a ranch deed. It was about a man who thought he could dictate the proper measure of everything, from loan payments to human worth. "You arrived too late," Margaret said into the silence. "Not just for my hand in marriage, but for everything else as well. This isn't Boston, Mr. Blackwood. We measure things differently here." "Indeed we do," James added, his voice carrying the strength of the land itself. We measure by what people build, what they contribute, how they help their neighbors grow." The gathering crowd murmured agreement. Through the windows, Margaret could see more townspeople arriving, drawn by word of the confrontation. Even the men who had once rejected her stood watching, their earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of this outside threat. Blackwood looked around, his carefully constructed scheme crumbling in the face of community solidarity. "This is highly irregular. My bank's reputation—" "Your reputation, Mr. Blackwood," Judge Wilson interrupted, "is precisely what's at stake. I have here sworn statements from multiple witnesses about the original loan payments. I have evidence of your attempt to manipulate property records. And I have a very interesting telegram from the Banking Commission in Boston responding to our inquiry about your authority to acquire territorial loans." The banker's face paled slightly. "I was merely trying to bring proper Eastern banking standards. You were trying to steal what others have built," Sarah cut in, her voice sharp with maternal protection. "Both their land and their happiness. I suggest," Judge Wilson said firmly, "that you withdraw your claim immediately, unless you'd prefer we pursue a full investigation into your banking practices." Blackwood's facade finally cracked. He looked again at the document spread before him, at the crowd of witnesses, at Margaret standing tall and proud beside her husband. In Boston, he had wielded power through papers and pronouncements. But here, power grew from the soil itself, from bonds between neighbors, from communities that stood together. He straightened his cravat nervously. "I appear to have been misled about certain aspects of this situation. Perhaps a withdrawal of the claim would be expedient, a wise choice." Judge Wilson nodded. "Mr. Peterson will draw up the necessary papers. I trust you'll find them quite thorough." As Peterson began preparing the documents, Margaret felt James's hand find hers. They had faced this challenge as they had faced every other, together, standing tall, supported by the community they had helped build. Blackwood signed the withdrawal with ill-concealed bitterness. As he turned to leave, he paused beside Margaret. "You could have had a very different life," he said softly. Margaret looked around at the bank filled with neighbors who had become family, at the town that had learned to see beyond first impressions, at the man beside her who had never asked her to be less than she was. "Yes," she agreed, meeting his eyes from her full height. "Thank God for that." 1 year later, Margaret stood in the photographer's studio, adjusting Sarah's shawl as they prepared for the family portrait. The past 12 months had brought changes to McKinnon Ranch. New cattle breeds James had imported from Texas, expanded grazing lands, and most importantly, the small bundle Sarah now cradled in her arms. "There now," the photographer said, positioning them carefully. "Mrs. McKinnon, if you could just sit down so I could—" "No," James interrupted gently. "We'll stand, all of us." He moved to Margaret's side, their infant daughter Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in his arms. "This is who we are," Sarah smiled up at them. Her health improved since the baby's arrival had brought new joy to the ranch. The silver in her hair caught the afternoon light, matching the frame of her mother's recipe book on the table beside her, now filled with Margaret's additions, their family history continuing in new handwriting. The photographer nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes as he saw not their height but their unity. Through his lens, he captured the McKinnons as they truly were, a family standing tall together, their strength drawn from each other and the land they loved. Outside the studio, Sweetwater Springs had changed too. The whispers that had once followed Margaret now spoke of her success, the thriving ranch, her growing friendship with the other wives, the seamstress shop she'd opened in town where she taught young girls that grace came in all sizes. "Perfect timing," James said as they left the studio. "We should make the gathering at the town hall." They walked together down the main street, where merchants nodded in greeting and children waved. Inside the hall, a group of newly arrived mail-order brides waited nervously, many of them women who didn't quite fit the usual expectations. Too tall, too educated, too independent. Margaret had begun writing to them after Blackwood's defeat, sharing her story through Mrs. Tate's network. "Come to Wyoming," she'd written. "Come where you can stand your full height." Sarah settled into a chair, baby Elizabeth now awake and reaching for her grandmother with tiny hands. James stood beside them as Margaret addressed the gathered women, her voice carrying the wisdom of experience. "Welcome to Sweetwater Springs," she said, meeting each anxious gaze. "You'll find we measure things differently here. We measure by the strength of your character, the size of your heart, and the height of your dreams." She felt James's hand slip into hers, saw Sarah's proud smile, and knew that every step of her journey, even the painful ones, had led her exactly where she belonged. Here, beneath Wyoming's vast sky, she had found not just acceptance, but celebration of who she was. The mountains rose beyond the town hall windows, their peaks reaching proudly toward heaven, reminding everyone who saw them that some things were meant to stand tall.